welcome to the third episode of the Pinch Pumpkin series. In this episode, I'll be teaching you how to create the stem of your pumpkin, which is super fun and gives you a lot of room for creativity and originality. So this is one of my favorite parts to make for this project. But there are some really important things that you need to know about the thickness of your stem specifically. So if your stem is thicker than your thumb in any area, then that means that it is going to be too thick for the inside of it to dry out all the way. And so that means that there will be moisture that's trapped inside of your stem because it doesn't have access to the air to make it dry out all the way. And so what happens when we fire something that has an air bubble that's trapped inside of it is that it gets put into the kiln, which is basically like an oven that reaches really high temperatures. And so if you've got any moisture in there inside of your clay, then all of those little molecules of water will start to kind of move because it's starting to feel the need to become steam. That's what happens when water gets really hot, right? And so those molecules will start to move around, but they'll have nowhere to escape. And so what happens is they'll burst out of the clay, usually making your project explode, which will create just like chunks, little pieces of your project that will be left behind. And sometimes those projects will explode and then hit other projects inside of the kiln, which will make those projects break. And inside of the kiln is a structure that has like multiple layers of projects that are just held up by stilts, little posts that go inside of the kiln. And so sometimes if one project explodes, it'll sort of rock those stilts and it'll make other projects break and things can come crashing down and it's just terrible. So please make sure that you do not leave any thick areas of your stem that are thicker than your thumb because they will explode in the kiln. So it's a very good reason to make sure you're following this rule. So while you're working on your stem, here are a couple of things that you should consider. Here are some examples of different styles of pumpkin stems, and I wanted to just point out first the shape. So you should be thinking through what style of shape of stem are you more interested. It could be something that's a little more curly, something that's a bit more extended. You can also incorporate the curly little bits that you would see from the vine that's attached to a pumpkin. So I really recommend trying to incorporate some type of twist or curve just because that is associated with what you would see on a pumpkin stem. They usually have curly little bits to them. So I think it's a helpful detail to add, to try and add a little twist or curl. Something else you should consider as you're making your stem is the amount of texture you're adding to it. I ordered these examples in the most spaced out lines, medium spaced out, and then a little bit too condensed of texture lines. So I wanted to just show you that I think that on this one, it might not be as successful because it's missing some of those important lines and because they just indented in here rather than kind of like smoothing this out and kind of like working that in so that it looks like it's like just a bumped edge. It looks more like a solid piece that has lines carved into it. So we're trying to kind of blend these lines into our shape and have it look like it's a natural texture. These two have a great amount of texture. I'd say that this is something you're striving for, where you've got just a lot of lines that are spaced with an adequate amount of room in between them, compared to this example where you can see that there's a bunch of lines that are really close together and very lightly carved in. So this might not be as successful because those lines are so light. It's really hard to see them and they didn't take the time to like go through and actually smooth those out. So I would say that these two are the best examples of what you should be going for in the texture and style of your stem. So now I'm going to walk you through the steps of one way to make this stem, and that does not mean that this is the only way. I'm just going to show you this option and keep in mind that you are welcome to try something different if you're interested in creating it in a different way, as long as you're meeting the parameters of not having it be thicker than your thumb and making sure that you have an adequate amount of spacing in between the texture of your lines and that your texture is at a good depth in your stem, so it's not too light and it's not too deep. To begin creating my stem, I just separated out a piece of clay and then tapped it on my table surface to try and give it some edges. I also was thinking about the length, like the height that I wanted my stem to be, so I decided to make it a little bit shorter for this example. I also compared it to the thickness of my pinky because that's about what we want. Remember that we don't want it to be any thicker than your thumb. When you look closely at a pumpkin stem, you usually see that there are some flat surfaces on that stem itself. So I used the flat edge of a needle tool, not the point, but the flat side of a needle tool to just kind of scrape away the curve on some of those sections. And I did that almost like I was slicing an apple, like I'm kind of just removing piece by piece off of that stem and trying to just flatten each of those sections before I add the texture to it. I also need to make sure I go back through and do the Pocahontas toe touch of water, just a very small amount, to smooth everything after I've done this step. The general shape of your pumpkin stem should be fairly wedge-shaped, which means that the top of your stem should be the thinnest point, and then it should slowly increase in thickness near the base of your stem. So starting skinny and increasing as it gets closer to your pumpkin. So to help with that, I set my stem down and just sort of smoothed along those flat edges that I created with my flat edge of my needle tool. And I was just going through and smoothing those down and kind of pressing down with some pressure as I reached the area that was touching the table, just trying to encourage the wedge shape of my stem. Next, I went through with a needle tool and I dragged it in the side. Now, the biggest mistake that students make is holding this so that it's perfectly perpendicular to their project, which means that it's like the point is going straight into your stem. And that can actually cause a lot of little crumbs to form in that line. And so it is a much better technique to press in with your needle tool rather than trying to draw in those lines. Once you've indented all of your texture and lines, you're going to do the Pocahontas toe touch in your water, and you're going to get just a very small amount so that you can use it to blend away any little crumblies that might have started on your stem. So the texture of your stem should really be quite smooth. What you should avoid here is accidentally filling in all of your lines and texture. It's a really common mistake to accidentally do that. You also have the option of twisting your lines and stem, and I think that that really does make it look a lot more like a pumpkin. So taking that stem, holding in one spot, and then just twisting a little bit, especially after you've added your water so that it doesn't start to crack too much, I think that that really is a great way to go. Adding just a little bit of a twist really does make it look more like a pumpkin. As you're working on your stem, if you realize that the base is starting to become thicker than your thumb, that means that you need to hollow it out, and it doesn't need to be hollowed all the way through. As you can see, the top of this example stem is really quite thin and didn't need to be hollowed, but I did show what it looks like when you hollow out the bottom of a stem. You have to incorporate an air hole that leads into the main air cavity of your pumpkin. So this air space should be connected. And you can see in the picture on the right that that stem has a hollowed out space, and you would score and slip the rim of that stem that was left behind after you hollowed it out, and you would attach it onto the pumpkin over the top of an air hole. And that air hole has to be there to connect those air cavities. Otherwise, you're trapping air inside of your stem and it will definitely explode. Once you have finished your stem, you need to get your pumpkin out of the plastic bag that it should have been in this entire time so it wasn't drying out. And you're going to flip it over to see which side of your pumpkin does your stem look best on. And you want to pick the best side to be the top of your pumpkin. Again, we want this stem to be a nice wedge shape. So what I'm doing here is just sort of pulling out the base in any way that I can, and try not to tear it. Like you see, I ripped it just a little bit, but we want to avoid that. And when we attach it, we are going to be scoring and slipping this onto our pumpkin. So scoring and slipping is something that you have to do to make these projects stick together permanently. If you skip this step, I can guarantee you your stem will not stay on permanently. And it may seem like it will while your clay is wet, but once it dries, it's just going to slide right off. So you need to add some little groove marks to both your stem and your pumpkin. You're going to add slip to one side. You don't have to do it for both. And you're going to attach your stem after you've added in just a few more marks. So the slip is what's acting like glue in this situation, and those marks are just roughing up the clay so that it has something to grip onto, so that when it dries, it doesn't just slide right off. As you're attaching your stem, you want to kind of wiggle around the base of your stem to make sure that those groove marks from scoring and slipping are encouraged to attach to each other. If you were to look at a real pumpkin stem, you would notice that the base of the stem actually has points that lead to each of the lines or dividing spaces between the sections of that pumpkin. And so what we're going to do is just use our needle tool or just that paper clip tool that you created for your disposable kit. You're going to take that tool and carve little arches in between each of your lines or dividing sections that you've created. So you want it to kind of look like it's rounded out for each section as it gets closer to the stem. A good goal would be to imagine a star shape that you're creating at the base of your stem, and all of the points of the star should be lining up with the lines that you've created with your paintbrush for your pumpkin. Once you've created all of the points for your base, then you're going to use a small amount of water to just blend those edges and make sure that they aren't too rough looking. While you're smoothing with water, you may actually end up losing some of your edges. So it's great to take just the pointed end of something, whether it's a wooden blending tool or the point of your shish kebab stick from your kits, and just go along those edges to kind of redefine that the section of your stem is separate from the area of your pumpkin. This step will be a lot of back and forth of working with smoothing after you've used a tool to create an edge, and then going back in with the water to make sure that you don't have any of what I call crumblies. So the crumblies are those tiny little pieces of clay that show up on your surface if you are not doing a good job of smoothing. And so it really does require a lot of back and forth. So that means that you're going to be creating your edge with your tool, and then you're going to be going back in and kind of cleaning it up and smoothing those outside edges with water. So it's a lot of back and forth, and it may seem like you should be done at a certain point, but I promise it took me a long time to get this stem attached and smoothed correctly. So feel free to take as long as you need, even try a couple of times, because this step can be quite tricky. And once you've added your stem and you feel confident about it, I would like for you to go through and do one last pass of smoothing before you move on to the next episode. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope it was helpful and that you learned a lot. So I'll see you for the next episode. Thanks for watching.